Yo, what is up, my friends? Welcome back into the podcast. I am Bryce Lockridge, your host of Crushing Fantasy Football. Guys, today I'm going to be talking about my 8 takeaways that I've seen from fantasy football this year in the regular season because we are only about 2 weeks away from the fantasy football playoffs. Most leagues have 2 weeks left of the regular season, and then it is playoff time, baby. So I'm going to be talking to you about what I've seen this year in fantasy football for the regular season and how it affects the way that we play fantasy football going forward. And I am going to get right into it, guys. But if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button below. And if you do enjoy my content today, make sure to give me a thumbs up, as likes help my channel tremendously. That's going to boost this video up that YouTube algorithm so that more people can see my channel and I can continue to give you content throughout the season and off season. All right, guys, I'm going to get into my first takeaway, and that is the importance of late round draft picks and handcuffs. We see it every year in fantasy football, guys. There are a few running back handcuffs in the draft every year that end up being elite fantasy options late in the season. One of the biggest ones of note, actually the biggest one of note, is Alexander Madison. Every year I tell people to draft this guy, and nobody does it. Nobody drafts Alexander Madison in their fantasy drafts. I mean, I am in 8 different leagues, and 7 out of my 8 leagues, I was able to get Alexander Madison after pick number 100 in the draft. This is just absolutely crazy. And I would have drafted him around 80th or 90th, but I know that he's going to slip in most situations. There was only one league where somebody reached for Alexander Madison, and I was actually very surprised. People never draft the elite handcuffs early enough. Guys like Alexander Madison, A.J. Dillon. We've seen it with other guys this year. Dearness Johnson, Chuba Hubbard. These are all guys that get taken way late in the draft, and then by the end of the year when the workhorse is banged up because they get way too much volume, the late round pick ends up being an elite running back one option. And we've seen it on a year-to-year basis, guys. This happens literally every year. So the importance of drafting elite handcuffs when you get the chance in your draft is absolutely important. Every year there's a handful of them going in that you absolutely need to start drafting for your fantasy teams in the late rounds because they're going to give you an awesome running back one performance by the end of the season and help you win your league. Also, just the importance of late round draft picks in general. It's really what separates the great fantasy players from the just okay fantasy players because everybody knows that you're supposed to take, Jonathan Taylor and Cooper Kupp and Tyreek Hill early in next year's draft. Everybody knows that. Even the most casual fantasy football players know who to take in the first, second, third rounds. It's really who you take after pick number 80 in the draft. It really starts to differentiate an okay fantasy player from a good or really good fantasy player because these are the players that end up giving you second or third round value and in some cases even first round value in like the 9th or 10th round of the draft. And that is ultimately what is going to win you your league, not taking X running back or X wide receiver in the first round. Anybody with half a brain can figure out how to do that, but it's the late round steals that end up winning you your league. So that's my first takeaway. We've seen it this year. I mean, we've seen it with Alexander Madison, A.J. Dillon, Chuba Hubbard. These are all handcuffed late round picks. Certain wide receivers that were taken late. I mean, we got Debo Samuel. We got Cooper Kupp was taken, around the 45th pick in most drafts. Adam Thielen was taken around pick number 40. We had Mike Williams who was taken late. I mean, there's just so many wide receivers that get drafted, after the 4th or 5th round that end up being awesome wide receiver options. So late round sleeper wide receivers are very, very important picks in fantasy football, and it's important to try to get your hands on these guys. So it just goes to show the importance of handcuffs and late round picks. Next on my list for my 8 takeaways is going to be that you simply just don't win your league with your draft. I mean, if you look at your team at the end of the season, there's a very high likelihood that 40 to 50% of your roster looks completely different than it did in week 1 when you drafted your team. And, people draft their team in week 1 and they look at that, final standing projection that it has on there and they're like, oh, I'm the number 2 projection. Like, I'm going to the fantasy championship. Guys, this is so stupid. That projector bot does not understand fantasy football. It can't possibly account for human unpredictability. All that thing knows how to do is crunch numbers. Anybody who takes this thing seriously should be laughed at because it crunches numbers. That's all it does. And it can't account for injuries. It can't account for common sense. Things like, is Tyreek Hill really going to get a 27% target share in the Chiefs offense next year? It doesn't know that. The only people that know that are people that crunch fantasy football numbers and know how to combine mathematics with common sense. And that machine only knows mathematics. It doesn't know mathematics plus common sense. So just because you draft a really good team and just because the projector bot has you really high doesn't mean anything, okay? Your team's going to look way different at the end of the year than it does at the beginning of the year anyway. So the point is, it's how you set your lineup on a week-to-week basis that matters, and it's how you manage the waiver wire and how you manage the trade market that ultimately determine whether or not you win your fantasy leagues. This is almost a cliche statement at this point because people tell you this every year. Fantasy experts are always like, oh, you don't win your league with your draft and blah, blah, blah. It's so true, guys. The importance of this cannot be stressed enough. It's how you manage your team throughout the season that matters. Okay, next on my list is I want to talk about Jonathan Taylor, guys. Jonathan Taylor is easily the most valuable dynasty asset going forward. This is just such common sense that I don't want to waste too much time talking about it, but I just got to give credit where credit is due. Jonathan Taylor is 22 years old. He is absolutely and utterly unstoppable. This dude might be the best running back in the entire NFL, and youth combined with talent, combined with massive scoring upside just due to all the boxes being checked for him scoring touchdowns like red zone usage and being in an offense that's starting to put up a lot of points, etc. This dude is easily the most valuable dynasty asset going forward. Next on my list, and this is just kind of a fun one right here, and it's that NFL officiating absolutely fucking blows. Now, this is obviously nothing to do with fantasy football. It's more real football, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it. But this Cowboys-Raiders game this past Thanksgiving was one of the most highly viewed NFL games in the regular season that we've seen in a very long time. So a lot of people got to see the game. And, guys, there was 28 flags thrown in this game. 28 flags. When was the last time you heard of 28 flags being thrown in a game? This is absolutely ridiculous. There were so many petty pass interference calls and holding calls and penalties that I've never even freaking heard of that were called in this game. And the refs had their hands in their pockets ready to throw a freaking flag before the plays even started. They were there to try to kind of put on a show and be the center of attention. They did not want a football game to happen. They wanted a refereeing contest, and that's exactly what they presented. And now Mike McCarthy and other people are petitioning the NFL to review the referee play or the referee performances this year. And I think a lot of refs are going to end up getting fired. If the NFL doesn't want to lose viewers, they've got to do something about their officiating crew. These are not world-class refs. These are absolutely terrible referees. You could literally find better referees with relative ease if you actually trained referees year-round and made somewhat of an effort to have actual professionals out there on the field because these refs are absolute trash. Okay, next on my list is going to be that red zone usage is quite literally everything for wide receivers in fantasy football. So, 5 out of the top 6 wide receivers this year, Cooper Kupp, Stephon Diggs, Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams, and Justin Jefferson, they all have one thing in common. They are top 10 in the NFL as far as red zone targets. Red zone targets are by far the most sure thing that you can look at when drafting a high-round wide receiver pick, okay? If a wide receiver is a top 10 red zone target and you have very good reason to believe that in the coming year they are going to be a top 10 red zone target in their offense, they are going to produce awesome fantasy numbers almost without doubt, okay? Every single season, the top 5 wide receivers in the NFL are almost always a top 10 red zone target. As we know in fantasy football, high-value touches are everything. And Cooper Kupp, Stephon Diggs, Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams, and Justin Jefferson, the best wide receivers in fantasy football, are all top 10 red zone targets. The only exception to that rule this year is Debo Samuel. And there's a few things accounting for that. Debo Samuel has had a ridiculous amount of big play touchdowns. He's had three out of his 5 receiving touchdowns have been outside of the red zone. He's actually only had 2 touchdowns scored within the red zone as far as passing is concerned. And he's had 5 rushing touchdowns, guys, 5 rushing touchdowns. I love me some Debo Samuel. I'm not trying to badmouth him in any way, but there is no way that he scores touchdowns next year in the same fashion that he has done this year. The amount of big play touchdowns is fluky. The amount of rushing touchdowns is fluky. I'm not saying that he can't have a great season next year, but if you expect him to score as many touchdowns next year with this few of red zone targets, you are in for a rude awakening because there is no way in the world that that's actually going to happen. I'm not saying don't invest high draft capital on Debo Samuel. I think the guy's very talented, and I think he's got a bright future in the NFL, but he's probably going to be drafted a little bit too highly next year considering the fact that he's 71st in the league in red zone targets and has managed to be the wide receiver 2. This is extremely fluky, and he's very exciting to watch, and it's been very fun to see what he's done this year. but there is no way that he is as good of a wide receiver next year as he was this year unless his red zone targets go up significantly. All right, next is that Tony Pollard is an extremely valuable fantasy asset. Guys, Tony Pollard is leading towards being the workhorse back in this offense. He's 2 years younger than Zeke. He's faster than Zeke. He's more elusive around the tackles than Zeke is. We saw him return a kickoff on a nationally televised game on Thanksgiving Day that was heavily viewed. A lot of people didn't know Tony Pollard until he returned that kick, but everybody knows Tony Pollard now. And the hype around this dude, combined with his talent, combined with the offense that he plays in, presents awesome fantasy upside. I mean, this guy is going to be a fantasy weapon going forward. So he was drafted as a late round pick, kind of handcuff player this year. He didn't even go in the top 100 in most drafts. I drafted him as a handcuff in a few of my leagues just in case Zeke got hurt, but I didn't think that he was going to be this awesome in conjunction with Zeke also playing. Even when Zeke plays, Tony Pollard holds immense fantasy value. And Zeke, that's getting a little bit later into his 20s and starting to deal with injury issues, could end up being an injured Zeke very soon in the near future that isn't a true running back one. And Tony Pollard could just totally take his place as a running back one in Dallas and be an awesome fantasy weapon. So Tony Pollard is extremely valuable for fantasy purposes going forward. I don't know how early he's going to go in the drafts next year. He's obviously probably going to be a top 65, 70 pick in the draft next year, but he should be a top 50 pick due to the fact that he's an elite handcuff behind Zeke. And more importantly, even with Zeke healthy, he might end up being the lead workhorse back on the team. Next takeaway that I have is that the zero running back draft strategy just isn't very smart, okay? And I'm going to explain to you why, okay? I'm not saying that the zero running back draft strategy absolutely can't work for maybe one season or two seasons if you happen to draft like the best of them, but you really have to be like a world-class fantasy football player and have world-class drafting skills to actually make the zero running back strategy work. Because this year, if you look at running backs that actually went outside of the top 30 picks in the draft that ended up being really good running backs, you're really just looking at Cordero Patterson, Leonard Fournette, and DeAndre Swift. That's it. All those guys were drafted outside of the top 30 overall picks and ended up being awesome running backs. So if you have so much draft savvy that you somehow drafted Tyreek Hill and Cooper Kupp, or Tyreek Hill and somehow got Tyreek Hill and Stephon Diggs as your first two picks, and then somehow drafted Cordero Patterson, which I doubt, or somehow drafted DeAndre Swift as your first running back, which I doubt, or maybe you were smart enough to draft Leonard Fournette as your first running back. Well, then maybe it worked out for you this year. But look how slim the odds are of that actually working. You had to be smart enough to either draft Cordero Patterson, Leonard Fournette, or DeAndre Swift as one of your first running backs. I would say out of all the millions of fantasy drafts that happen, that very, very, very few, if anyone, actually did this. So to say that you're going to go into a draft in a given season and draft two elite wide receivers, pass up on the early round running backs, and then hit that one really lucky home run with a running back pick outside of the top 30 overall picks in the draft, you're a little bit overly ambitious. Okay, and if you happen to be savvy enough to do this and actually pull it off over one season, the odds of that continuing to happen, and if you're playing in multiple leagues and playing over, playing for the long run, right? If you're playing for this to work for you every single season and for this strategy to be something that wins you money year in and year out, you're in for a rude awakening. That's not going to happen. The odds of that actually working are microscopically slim because there are so few running backs that go outside of the top 30 picks that actually end up being number one running backs, that if you actually pick up that running back outside of the top 30 overall picks that ends up being that home run running back for you, you're honestly just extremely lucky. So anybody that tells you that they're going to draft wide receiver, and then go into running backs, or even just wide receiver, then go into running backs, that's not smart fantasy football strategy because your odds of getting that true running back one with your third or fourth pick in the draft are just so incredibly unlikely. And doing that over the course of the long run, over many years in many leagues, it's darn near impossible. Okay, so the zero running back draft strategy is not smart. Don't listen to anyone that tells you that this can work because it's just silly. All right, last and final takeaway of the fantasy football season is to, not a lot of people like to hear this because they want to win this year. They want the money now, and I get it. Like, I fall into that too. But you've got to have a long-term mindset when it comes to fantasy football because there are so many things that happen in a given season in fantasy football that are extremely fluky and that even the best fantasy football experts in the world can't predict. Things like Cordero Patterson being a top 10 running back this year, or, the first two picks in the draft, consensus first two picks, were Christian McCaffrey and Dalvin Cook. Looks like both of these guys are very likely to be out for the season. I mean, it looks like CMC is out for the season, and then Dalvin Cook has that torn labrum in his shoulder, and it looks like there's a very good likelihood that he's going to be out for the season. So people that had the number 1 and number 2 picks in the draft and a lot of ESPN leagues are probably not going to win their league this year because they had that number 1 or number 2 pick, which a lot of people get excited about. That guy got hurt. And then their next best player is either just okay running back or maybe an elite wide receiver, and they're left with absolutely no running backs. So there are things that happen like these kind of things in the fantasy football season that are, I don't want to say fluky because injuries happen every year, but there's a lot of things that happen in a fantasy football season that absolutely can't be predicted preseason. They're just random acts of human unpredictability. They happen, and it either helps you out or it screws you over. So over the course of just one league, one fantasy football season, there are so many variables and so much luck involved that putting too much emotion or too much money into one season in one league just isn't very smart. You should be playing in multiple leagues every single year. You should be playing in at least 5 leagues. At least 5 leagues every single year. If you're playing in less than 5 leagues, then you're just not getting a large enough sample size for your skill in fantasy football to really shine over the long term. You're really just, you're hoping to get lucky. You're just gambling, essentially. But if you're playing in 5+ leagues every year and looking at how much money you're going to make over the next decade, now you're talking, because you're talking about 50 different leagues that you play in over the next decade or more. Hopefully you're in 10 or 12 leagues. The more leagues, the better. If you're a true fantasy football nut like I am, you want to be in as many leagues as possible and have a long-term mindset, because it's the winners of fantasy football that win over the long term that are the truly good fantasy football players. The worst player in your league could win your league this year because he gets lucky, but that's just one league and one season. So guys, you've got to have a long-term mindset, and fantasy football is a heck of a lot more fun when you win. I mean, I know that I can have fun in fantasy football whether I win and lose, but I would rather win money over the next 10 years in fantasy football than lose money, wouldn't you? So that's my point here. All right, guys, I appreciate you tuning into the video today. These are just my top 8 takeaways from the 2021 fantasy football season. I wish you guys the best of luck in the rest of the regular season. I'm going to be with you almost every day for the rest of the regular season and the playoffs. And let's get this W this coming week, and let's win our fantasy championships. Peace.